Some men die twice. Once when their heart stops beating, and again when the world forgets their name. Silas Boone understood that better than most. For nearly 12 years, he had lived alone on a stretch of hard Arizona land where the wind never seemed to rest and the sun ruled everything beneath it. His cabin stood on a lonely rise more than 20 miles from the nearest town, surrounded by dry grass, scattered mesquite trees, and miles of open country that looked beautiful from a distance and unforgiving up close. Every morning began the same way. Before dawn, Silas stepped onto his porch with a tin cup of coffee, listening to the silence. Not the peaceful kind. The heavy kind. The kind that settled into a man's bones after years without company. His nearest neighbors were coyotes that sang to the moon and hawks circling overhead in search of movement below. Out there, a man learned to fix his own fences, mend his own roof, and carry his troubles without asking anyone for help. The desert demanded it. Summer heat often climbed past 100 degrees. Winter nights could turn sharp enough to freeze water left outside. Dust storms appeared without warning, swallowing the horizon and leaving everything coated in fine red dirt. Most ranchers eventually gave up and moved somewhere easier. Silas stayed. People in town had their own theories about why. Some said he was stubborn. Others claimed he simply hated people. A few whispered that he was running from something. The truth was quieter than the rumors. Years ago, Silas had trusted people. He had believed friendships lasted and promises meant something. Then life taught him otherwise. A business partner disappeared with nearly everything he owned. Friends he thought would stand beside him vanished when times became difficult. One by one, the connections that tied him to the world snapped until solitude felt safer than disappointment. So he stopped expecting much from anyone. He worked. He survived. He kept to himself. And little by little, the world forgot him. Strangely, Silas didn't seem to mind. At least that was what he told himself. Yet every evening, after feeding his horse and locking away his tools, he would sit on the porch watching the sunset bleed across the desert sky. Sometimes his eyes lingered on the distant road leading toward town. Sometimes he watched longer than he intended. Deep down, a small part of him still waited for something he could never quite name. Then came the day everything changed. It started with a rider arriving from town just before sunset. The man looked exhausted from the journey. His horse carried a layer of dust thick enough to dull its color. Silas offered him water without asking questions. The rider accepted gratefully and spoke only a few words before climbing back into the saddle. "There's an Apache woman heading this way," he said. "Been asking questions about a dead elder. Folks say she's riding with purpose." The rider paused, studying Silas carefully. "And for some reason, she's looking for the man who buried him." As the stranger disappeared into the fading light, Silas stood motionless on his porch. Far beyond the western ridge, where the last sunlight touched the horizon, he thought he saw the faint outline of a single rider approaching. The desert had a way of warning people before trouble arrived. Most men simply failed to notice. Silas Boone noticed. The morning after the rider's visit, he stepped onto his porch before sunrise and immediately felt that something was different. The air seemed heavier. The birds that usually gathered near the water trough were nowhere to be seen. Even the wind had gone quiet, as if the land itself was listening. He poured coffee into his tin cup and studied the horizon. Nothing moved except distant waves of heat rising from the desert floor. Yet the uneasy feeling remained. By mid-morning, his horse began acting strangely. Dusty was usually calm, the kind of animal that barely lifted its head at passing coyotes. Now the old gelding kept glancing toward the western ridge, ears twitching, muscles tense beneath his hide. Twice he refused to drink. 3 times he paced the fence line before stopping to stare at the same patch of distant ground. Silas trusted animals. They sensed things long before people did. Around noon, he climbed the hill behind his cabin carrying a spyglass. The Sunlight reflected off endless miles of desert rock and dry grass. At first he saw nothing. Then a tiny shape appeared far away, barely more than a dark speck moving against the pale earth. A rider. Alone. The figure traveled steadily, neither rushing nor slowing, as though every mile had already been measured before the journey began. Hours passed. The rider grew larger. Silas returned to his chores, but every few minutes he found himself looking toward the road. By late afternoon, the stranger finally reached the rise leading to the cabin. She rode a dark bay horse coated with dust from a long journey. Her posture remained straight despite what had to be days in the saddle. Long black hair moved gently in the breeze. Her expression revealed little. She seemed neither tired nor impressed by what she saw. She simply observed. The way experienced people do. Silas stepped onto the porch. The woman brought her horse to a stop nearly 20 feet away. For several seconds, neither spoke. The desert stretched around them in complete silence. Then she looked directly at him. Her eyes were calm, steady, and surprisingly familiar. Not because he had seen her before, but because they carried the same quiet loneliness he recognized in himself. "You are Silas Boone," she said. Her voice was soft, yet carried easily across the distance. It was not a question. Silas nodded once. "And you are looking for the man who buried the elder." The woman studied him for another moment. Then she dismounted. "My name is Ayana Red Hawk." The name seemed to settle into the air between them. Neither friendly nor hostile. Simply important. She walked toward the porch with measured steps and stopped near the railing. Dust from hundreds of miles still clung to her boots. "Thank you for giving my father respect when others would not." Silas had expected anger. Perhaps grief. Instead, he found dignity. That unsettled him more than either. Before he could answer, Ayana reached beneath her jacket and removed a small silver medallion hanging from a leather cord. The instant Silas saw it, his pulse quickened. It was identical to the one he had quietly recovered from the elder's belongings before the burial. Then Ayana turned the medallion over, revealing an engraving. Silas stared at it in disbelief. Somehow, impossibly, the symbol carved into the silver was the exact same mark etched into a weathered wooden box hidden beneath the floorboards of his cabin. Some secrets do not arrive with threats. They arrive with silence. After seeing the matching symbol on Ayana's medallion and the wooden box hidden beneath his floorboards, Silas expected questions. Instead, Ayana simply looked at him for a long moment, then slipped the medallion back beneath her jacket. She did not ask about the box. She did not ask why he looked surprised. It was as if she already knew that answers would come later. For the next few days, life settled into a strange routine neither of them had expected. Ayana remained at the cabin while waiting for riders from her tribe. The journey back to Apache territory would take time, and the desert was not forgiving to travelers moving alone. Silas offered the small spare room beside the kitchen. She accepted with a simple nod. No argument. No gratitude spoken aloud. Just quiet understanding. During daylight hours, they moved around each other like strangers learning the shape of the same room. Silas repaired fences. Ayana helped carry water from the well. He fed the horses. She gathered firewood from the nearby hills. Their conversations remained brief. Practical. Careful. Yet Silas noticed things. He noticed that Ayana always chose the chair facing the door. He noticed she never sat with her back toward a window. At night, when the wind rattled the cabin walls, she would pause whatever she was doing and listen. Not casually. Intently. Like someone waiting for a sound she hoped never to hear. The behavior became impossible to ignore. One evening, while sharing a simple meal of beans and cornbread, a loose shutter suddenly slammed against the side of the cabin. The noise was harmless. A common sound in desert country. Yet Ayana's hand instantly moved toward her side. Her eyes locked on the door. Every muscle in her body tightened before she realized there was no danger. Then, just as quickly, she relaxed and continued eating. Silas pretended not to notice. But he did. The next morning, he found tracks near the well. Human tracks. Fresh. He followed them for nearly a quarter-mile before they disappeared into rocky ground. The prints were probably harmless. A traveler passing through. Maybe a hunter. Yet when he returned and casually mentioned them, Ayana's expression changed. Only for a second. A flicker of concern. Then it vanished. Many people travel these lands, she said. Not all of them wish to be seen. The answer stayed with him. That evening, the sky filled with deep orange light as the sun sank behind distant mesas. Silas was repairing a section of fence when he noticed Ayana struggling with a heavy bucket near the well. He started toward her to help. She turned too quickly. The bucket slipped. Water spilled across the dirt. As she reached to catch it, her sleeve pulled back. Silas froze. There, along her forearm, partially hidden beneath the fabric, was a long scar. Not fresh. Not recent. Old enough to have healed. But unmistakable. For a moment, Ayana looked down and realized what had happened. Her eyes widened slightly. Then she pulled her sleeve down with surprising speed. Neither spoke. The desert wind moved softly through the grass. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried out. Finally, Ayana picked up the bucket and turned away. But before she disappeared inside the cabin, Silas noticed something else. Near the scar was the same symbol carved into her silver medallion, marked faintly into her skin as if it had been there for years. Some wounds heal into scars. Others become silence. For the next 2 days, neither Silas nor Ayana mentioned the mark on her arm. Yet the memory lingered between them like smoke after a campfire. Every time she adjusted her sleeve, Silas noticed. Every time he glanced at her arm, she noticed him noticing. Still, neither spoke. The desert remained unchanged. The sun rose. The wind moved across the dry grass. Dusty wandered the pasture. Life continued. But something beneath the surface had begun to shift. On the third evening, clouds gathered over the distant mountains. Rain was rare that time of year, and both of them worked quickly to secure supplies before the weather arrived. As they carried sacks of grain into the barn, thunder rolled far away across the horizon. The sound seemed harmless. Yet Silas saw the familiar tension return to Ayana's face. She paused for a moment and looked toward the darkening sky. Not with fear of the storm itself. With the look of someone remembering something she wished to forget. Later, while rain tapped softly against the cabin roof, they sat across from each other at the kitchen table. A lantern cast warm light over the room. For a long time, neither spoke. Then Ayana surprised him. "My father believed that memories are like rivers," she said quietly. Silas looked up. "How so?" She stared at the flame inside the lantern. "You can spend your whole life trying to stop them. They still find a way through." The room grew still. Outside, rain continued falling across the desert. "Your father seemed wise," Silas said. A faint smile touched her face before fading. "He had to be." For several seconds, she remained silent. Then she spoke again. "When I was young, he taught me that trust was a gift. He said not everyone deserved it." Her eyes drifted toward the window. He was right. Silas understood more than she realized. He thought about the years he had spent alone. About promises broken long ago. About how easy it had become to expect disappointment from people. "Someone gave me the same lesson," he said. Ayana glanced at him. "And did you learn it?" Silas let out a quiet breath. Too well. Something changed then. Not dramatically. Not all at once. Just enough. For the first time, Ayana seemed to see him not as the stranger who buried her father, but as someone carrying his own invisible weight. The conversation drifted into stories. Small ones. Safe ones. She spoke about following her father through desert canyons as a child. About learning the names of stars. About nights spent around tribal fires listening to elders tell stories older than memory. Silas shared stories of ranch work, stubborn horses, and the mistakes young men make when they think they know everything. Several times they even laughed. The sound felt strange inside the cabin. As if the walls had forgotten it existed. When the storm finally passed, moonlight spilled across the porch. Ayana stepped outside and stood looking toward the distant hills. Silas joined her a few moments later. Neither spoke. The silence no longer felt heavy. It felt comfortable. Then Ayana quietly rolled back her sleeve. Not all the way. Just enough. This mark, she said, touching the symbol near the scar, was given to those entrusted with protecting something important. Silas turned toward her. Before he could ask another question, her expression changed. She was staring into the darkness beyond the pasture. Her eyes narrowed. "We are not alone tonight," she whispered. Following her gaze, Silas saw it too. Far beyond the fence line, a single lantern light moved slowly across the desert where no traveler should have been. The lantern light vanished before dawn. Neither Silas nor Ayana slept much after seeing it move across the desert. Yet when morning arrived, no rider appeared. No tracks reached the cabin. No stranger knocked on the door. The mystery remained out there somewhere beyond the rolling hills and endless miles of dry earth. Life, however, demanded attention. A section of fence along the northern pasture had collapsed during the storm. One of the water troughs needed repairs. The roof above the storage shed leaked whenever rain passed through. For the first time in years, Silas was not facing those problems alone. They spent the morning hauling lumber beneath a bright Arizona sky. The air smelled of sun-warmed wood and dust. Sweat darkened Silas's shirt as he lifted fence posts into place. Without being asked, Ayana steadied each beam while he worked. Neither wasted words. They developed a rhythm. One moved. The other anticipated. One carried tools. The other already knew which tool would be needed next. By midday, the broken fence stood stronger than before. Silas leaned against the rail and looked over the pasture. "I usually spend 3 days fixing that section myself." Ayana brushed dust from her hands. "Then perhaps you were doing it wrong." For a second, Silas stared at her. Then he laughed. A real laugh. The kind he had not heard from himself in years. The sound surprised both of them. Later that afternoon, they rode out to inspect a distant spring nearly 2 miles from the cabin. The trail wound through rocky ground covered with sagebrush and desert grass. Above them, hawks drifted on warm currents of air. For a while, they traveled in comfortable silence. Eventually Ayana spoke. "My father always said work reveals character faster than words." Silas glanced toward her. "What did you learn?" She considered the question. "You do not complain much." "That is because nobody listens." A small smile appeared at the corner of her mouth. It stayed there longer than usual. When they reached the spring, they discovered part of the stone edge had collapsed, muddying the water. The repair required hours of lifting heavy rocks and clearing debris. By sunset both were exhausted. Their hands were dirty. Their clothes were covered in dust. Yet the spring flowed clean again. On the ride home, the sky turned orange and gold. Long shadows stretched across the desert floor. For the first time, Silas noticed that the loneliness he carried every evening felt lighter. Not gone. Just quieter. That night, they sat on the porch watching stars emerge one by one. The air smelled of rain left behind by the recent storm. Somewhere in the distance, coyotes called to one another. Ayana looked toward the horizon. When I was a child, my father taught me every star he could name. Her voice softened. After my mother passed away, he never let me feel alone. Silas remained silent for a moment. Then he surprised himself. My father was the same. He rarely spoke about family. Almost never. Yet the words came naturally. They spent the next hour sharing memories. Not painful ones. Good ones. Simple ones. Stories about lessons learned, mistakes made, and people whose kindness still echoed years later. The conversation felt less like strangers talking and more like old wounds slowly finding air and sunlight after being hidden too long. Then, as the moon climbed higher, Dusty suddenly lifted his head from the pasture. His ears pointed toward the northern ridge. Ayana noticed immediately. So did Silas. Both rose from their chairs. Far away in the darkness, where the desert met the sky, a second lantern light had appeared. This one was not moving across the horizon. It was standing still, watching the cabin. The lantern remained on the ridge until sunrise. Neither Silas nor Ayana could explain it. No rider approached during the night. No horse crossed the pasture. Yet when dawn finally washed over the desert, the light was gone as if it had never existed. The mystery settled over the ranch like dust carried by the wind. 3 days passed. Then the past arrived. It came just after noon beneath a sky so clear it seemed endless. Silas was repairing a gate near the barn when Dusty lifted his head and gave a low warning snort. Across the distant road, a wagon appeared. Not unusual by itself. Travelers occasionally crossed the territory. What caught Silas's attention was the way Ayana reacted. She had been carrying water from the well. The moment she saw the wagon, she froze. The bucket slipped slightly in her hands. Water spilled onto the dry ground. For an instant, her face lost all color. Then she quickly looked away. Silas noticed. He always noticed now. The wagon rolled closer, pulled by 2 bay horses. A gray-haired man sat on the driver's bench. Beside him rode a younger man dressed in town clothes too fine for ranch work. Neither looked dangerous. Yet Ayana's expression told a different story. By the time the wagon reached the yard, she had disappeared into the cabin. The older man stepped down first. His movements were careful, deliberate. Years seemed to rest heavily on his shoulders. When his eyes found Silas, relief appeared across his face. "You must be Silas Boone," he said. "Name is Walter Hensley." The name meant nothing to Silas. Not at first. Then Walter removed something from his coat pocket. A silver medallion. The same symbol. The same design. The same mark carried by Ayana and her father. Silas felt the world narrow around that small piece of silver. Walter noticed the reaction immediately. "So she is here," he said quietly. Before Silas could respond, the cabin door opened. Ayana stepped outside. The moment she saw Walter, her expression changed completely. Not fear. Not anger. Something deeper. The kind of emotion that comes from old memories that never truly fade. Walter removed his hat. "It has been a long time, Ayana." Neither moved for several seconds. The younger man beside Walter shifted uneasily, clearly aware he was standing in the middle of a story much older than himself. Finally Ayana spoke. "You should not have come." Walter lowered his eyes. "I know." The words carried weight. Enough weight that Silas understood this was not an ordinary reunion. Throughout the afternoon, pieces of the truth emerged. Years ago, before Silas had ever heard the name Red Hawk, Walter had worked alongside Ayana's father. They had shared responsibility for protecting something entrusted to only a handful of people. Something connected to the symbol. Something important enough that even now people remained willing to search for it. Yet every answer seemed to create two new questions. As sunset approached, Walter sat on the porch with Silas while Ayana remained inside. The old man stared toward the distant hills. Her father spent years keeping certain things hidden, he said quietly. Some secrets protect people. Others attract the wrong kind of attention. Silas glanced toward the cabin window. Attention from who? Walter hesitated. For the first time, genuine concern crossed his face. Then he pointed toward the horizon. Far away, beyond the northern ridge, a thin column of dust was rising into the evening sky. More than one rider. More than two. Moving steadily toward the ranch. The men who finally realized the secret did not die with her father, Walter said softly. And I am afraid they have found us. A man can spend years running from a storm only to discover it was following him all along. That night, after Walter revealed that the riders might already be searching for them, nobody at the cabin slept much. The desert seemed different now. Every sound carried meaning. Every shadow felt longer. The wind brushing against the walls no longer sounded peaceful. It sounded like a warning. Before sunrise, Silas found Ayana sitting alone on the porch. She had been there for hours. The first pale light of dawn touched the horizon, painting the distant mesas in shades of gold and red. For a long moment neither spoke. Then Ayana surprised him. I am tired of running. Her voice was calm. Not angry. Not emotional. Certain. Silas sat beside her. She kept her eyes fixed on the horizon. For years, my father moved from place to place protecting something he believed mattered more than himself. After he died, I continued moving because I thought that was what he would have wanted. She lowered her gaze. Now I think I was wrong. The words hung in the cool morning air. What changed? Silas asked quietly. Ayana looked toward the ranch. Toward the repaired fences. The barn. The well. The life they had slowly rebuilt together over the past days. Running only protects secrets, she said. It does not protect people. Later that morning, Walter finally revealed more of the truth. The symbol carried by the medallions was not simply a tribal mark. Decades earlier, a small group of trusted men from different backgrounds had hidden records proving that several wealthy landowners had gained enormous territories through deception. The documents had disappeared before they could be used. Many assumed they were lost forever. They were not. Ayana's father had spent years safeguarding clues leading to them. Suddenly the wooden box hidden beneath Silas's floorboards no longer seemed like a coincidence. They gathered around the kitchen table. Dust floated through beams of sunlight streaming from the windows. Walter carefully examined the box. The same symbol appeared on its lid. For several minutes he searched its edges before finding a nearly invisible notch. A hidden compartment slid open. Inside lay a bundle of old papers wrapped in weathered cloth. Silence filled the room. Walter unfolded the first page with trembling hands. His eyes widened immediately. These are copies, he whispered. Not all of them. But enough. The papers contained names. Dates. Property transfers. Signatures. Fragments of a story someone had tried very hard to bury. Ayana studied each page carefully. Silas watched her expression change. The fear he had seen since the day she arrived was slowly being replaced by something stronger. Resolve. Throughout the afternoon they organized every document. Walter explained connections. Ayana recorded details. Silas rode into town and quietly gathered maps and county records that matched the names appearing on the pages. Piece by piece, the puzzle began taking shape. By sunset, the kitchen table was covered with evidence. Yet none of them felt victorious. The more they learned, the more obvious the danger became. Whoever was searching for these records would not stop now. As darkness settled over the ranch, Ayana carried the medallion outside and stood beneath the stars. Silas joined her. "Are you afraid?" he asked. She thought for a moment. Yes. Then she looked directly at him. "But I am more afraid of what happens if nobody speaks." Before Silas could answer, Dusty suddenly let out a sharp warning call from the pasture. Both turned toward the northern ridge. There, illuminated by moonlight, stood 3 riders watching the ranch. And this time, they made no effort to hide. The 3 riders remained on the ridge until sunrise. They did not approach. They did not call out. They simply watched. That made them more unsettling than any open threat. By morning they were gone, leaving only tracks pressed into the dry earth. Walter studied those tracks carefully. His expression darkened. "They know exactly where we are now," he said. Nobody argued. The following day, Silas, Ayana, and Walter loaded the documents into the wagon. If the evidence was going to matter, it needed to reach people who could no longer ignore it. The nearest county office sat nearly 30 miles away. The journey would take most of the day. As they prepared to leave, Ayana stood alone beside the well. The morning sun reflected softly from the silver medallion hanging around her neck. Silas approached quietly. "Still time to leave," he said. Ayana looked toward the distant mountains where she had spent years moving from place to place. For a moment, she seemed to be looking at her entire past. Then she shook her head. "That is exactly what they expect." Her voice carried a strength he had not heard before. "My father spent years protecting the truth. I spent years hiding from it. Today ends both." The wagon rolled across the desert beneath a cloudless sky. Dust followed behind them for miles. Every ridge seemed to conceal unknown eyes. Every bend in the trail felt important. Yet the further they traveled, the calmer Ayana became. Something had changed inside her. Fear had once controlled every decision. Now purpose did. By late afternoon they reached the county courthouse. The building stood at the center of a small town surrounded by merchants, ranchers, and travelers. Word spread quickly. People gathered outside. Some recognized Walter. Others recognized the symbol on the medallion. Many had heard rumors for years but never believed them. Inside, the records were examined one by one. Property maps. Signatures. Dates. Correspondence. Every piece connected to the next. The truth slowly unfolded like a long-forgotten trail finally revealed beneath drifting sand. Several influential landowners arrived before sunset. Men whose names appeared repeatedly throughout the documents. They entered with confidence. That confidence did not last. The evidence spoke louder than any argument. Every page raised another question. Every answer led back to the same people. For hours the room remained tense. Yet no shouting filled the air. No dramatic confrontation occurred. Something more powerful happened instead. Facts accumulated. Witnesses spoke. Records matched. The truth simply refused to move. Silas watched from the back of the room. Beside him, Walter looked 20 years older than he had that morning. Beside Walter stood Ayana. Calm. Steady. Unwavering. The same woman who once scanned every horizon for danger now stood before an entire room and spoke without hesitation. She spoke about her father. About responsibility. About why secrets should never matter more than justice. Nobody interrupted her. Nobody could. Because for the first time, she was no longer protecting herself. She was protecting the truth. By nightfall, the officials announced a formal investigation. The disputed claims would be reviewed. The records would be preserved. The evidence would remain public. Several powerful men left the courthouse looking smaller than when they had entered. Outside, townspeople gathered beneath lantern light. Conversations spread through the streets. Questions that had remained buried for decades were finally being asked. As the crowd slowly dispersed, Silas stepped onto the courthouse porch. The desert wind felt different somehow. Lighter. Ayana joined him. For several moments neither spoke. Then Walter emerged carrying a sealed envelope. His face had turned pale. "There is one more thing," he said quietly. "Something your father never wanted anyone to find." He handed the envelope to Ayana. Written across the front in her father's handwriting were 6 simple words. "For my daughter if I fail." Ayana stared at the letter without opening it. And for the first time that day, genuine uncertainty appeared in her eyes. By the time winter arrived, the desert looked like a different world. The fierce summer heat had faded into cool mornings touched by frost. Thin sheets of ice sometimes appeared along the edges of the water trough before sunrise. The wind still crossed the open land, but it carried a gentler voice now. Months had passed since the day the truth came into the light. The investigation continued. Records were reviewed. Old claims were corrected. The secret that Ayana's father had protected for so long no longer belonged to a handful of people. It belonged to history. The letter he left behind had changed everything. Inside were not instructions for revenge. Not warnings. Not hidden treasure. Instead, the pages contained reflections written during the final years of his life. He wrote about responsibility. About courage. About the danger of allowing fear to make decisions for us. Most of all, he wrote about trust. One sentence stayed with Ayana more than any other. Trust is not something you find. It is something you choose. She carried those words with her every day. Back at the ranch, life settled into a rhythm neither she nor Silas could have imagined months earlier. The fences stood strong. The spring flowed clean. The barn roof no longer leaked. Work still filled most days, but the silence between them had changed. It was no longer the silence of strangers. It was the silence of people who understood each other without needing many words. Some mornings they drank coffee on the porch while the sun climbed above the horizon. Some evenings they sat beneath the stars sharing stories that once felt too personal to tell. Little by little, old wounds lost their power. The loneliness that had followed Silas for more than a decade no longer seemed permanent. The fear that had shadowed Ayana across countless miles no longer controlled her future. One cold afternoon, snow appeared on the distant mountain peaks. Dusty wandered peacefully through the pasture while a small fire crackled inside the cabin stove. Walter visited often now. Age still weighed heavily on him, but the burden he had carried for years seemed lighter. Sometimes he would sit at the kitchen table for hours, smiling quietly as he watched the 2 people he cared about most move around the room. One evening, as winter sunlight faded beyond the western ridge, Ayana stepped onto the porch carrying 2 blankets. Silas was already there, watching the sky change colors above the desert. She handed him one blanket and sat beside him. Neither spoke immediately. They did not need to. Finally, Ayana looked toward the cabin. Warm light glowed through the windows. Walter's laughter drifted outside from somewhere near the stove. Dusty stood near the fence line. Smoke rose gently from the chimney into the evening sky. It was not a grand house. It was not a wealthy ranch. Yet somehow it felt like the richest place either of them had ever known. Ayana smiled softly. For a long time, I thought home was a place you could lose. Silas looked toward the cabin and then back at her. Maybe home is the people who stay. The last light of day settled across the land. The wind moved through the grass. Inside the cabin, warmth waited. Outside, 2 people sat side by side watching winter arrive,